first of all, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I know a lot of you were also here yesterday for our workshop on biodiversity, and I just want to thank you on behalf of our branch. We're putting a lot more emphasis now on trying to communicate the science that we're doing. I hope we've been able to convince you over the last 2 days that we have been doing an awful lot of research over the last, particularly over the last 10 years. A lot of that has been focused on LIDAR. I also want to acknowledge a lot of people. I've heard my name mentioned a lot today. I actually do very little. I sign grant agreements. I try to arrange funding. There's a lot of people who've made this body of work possible. Chris, in his presentation this morning, showed you a last slide of the crew at the University of New Brunswick. They actually are the ones who have generated the wet areas mapping model over the last decade. Principal to that is Jay Ogilvy. He's the modeling guru that sits there every day working on the model. And there's been a tremendous amount of innovation that's gone into that model in the last 2 years. And I know even in the last 3 months, Jay's been sitting there pulling his hair out. And because we're always, the more complicated we make the model, the more problems that we encounter. There's a lot of other students at the University of New Brunswick who work on this. Some of them are in the room here today. And then there's a lot of people at the University of Alberta who have joined this initiative over the last 5 or 6 years. You've heard from most of them today, but there's been a lot of graduate students over there, and I hope most of them are in the room today, that have been working to make this model better for Alberta. We've had a lot of industry support as we've moved along over the last 10 years, and you've heard from some of them, and probably our biggest one has been Dayashawa, Marubeni, but we've had many others like Miller Western in the initial days, Alberta Pacific. We've had support from the energy sector, Devon Energies, ConocoPhillips, Statoil, particularly for donating helicopter time to fly all of our students around from plot to plot so they didn't have to use quads. That was when oil was $140 a barrel, though. You also didn't hear, listening to the presentations today, we didn't talk about the history of wet areas mapping. And just really, really briefly, this was a presentation that I saw back in 2004 in New Brunswick. And I flew back, it's where I'm from. It was a riparian workshop, and I saw Professor Paul Arp, who I knew from earlier years, give a presentation on wet areas mapping and how they thought it could be applied in riparian management. And I was a very new employee to the Alberta government at that time, but I knew, or I thought at that time, that this might really address a lot of the issues that we had in New Brunswick, in Alberta. But there was a lot of doubt at that time, in my mind, as to whether something that was developed in the Maritimes could be applied here in Alberta. And the real concern was the fact that our soils are so dramatically different. You heard mention this morning in Darren's opening comments that our very first workshop was held in this building. And we brought the UMB team out and we had a lot of discussions with this work, how would we fund it, et cetera, et cetera. And we actually weren't sure that this was going to move forward. We got some very encouraging comments from our Deputy Minister, Bob Fezenden, at that time. He was an old soils mapper. He was quite encouraged by what he saw, and he gave us a thumbs up as he left the room, and that got us going. We first received funding from the FRIA Open Funds and collaboration with Miller Western. In the early years, a couple years after that, we started work in the boreal forest with funding from the Sustainable Forest Management Network. And in 2008, we faced a decision within the government. We had two choices. We could allow industry in Alberta to work privately with the University of New Brunswick to map their individual areas, or the second alternative was for the government of Alberta to fund all of this work ourselves and ensure that it would remain a public data set. We chose the latter. So from 2008 onwards, this has been funded largely by the Alberta government, and it was that commitment in 2008 made by the Deputy Minister then, Brad Pickering, that because this focused on water in Alberta, and water is such an important value and it's owned by all Albertans, this would be an Alberta-driven initiative, and that every data that came out of it would be publicly available. Much of the information that you've heard over the last 2 days has been because of a number of different drivers. And I'm just going to go through these really quickly because you all know them. One is the call for diversification and really the driving down of cost within industry to make it more competitive, regardless of the sector. We also know from reading newspapers and CNN and others and that the world is really watching Alberta, and they don't always like what they see. Our goal within the government, and I think most Alberta citizens, is that we want to be environmental stewards, but we also have to prove it. We have to be accountable for what we do. We heard some comments yesterday about to remind ourselves that we really have to be able to prove that we're the best environmental stewards. It's not enough just to say it. Regulators ourselves require planning tools and monitoring tools that are cost effective. We know we all know the situation that we're in today. We need to make sure that we've got data sets and monitoring protocols and tools that allow us to do things better, faster, with fewer resources. And we say that many, many times over the years, but now it really counts. We know that we're not going to have the same number of bodies as we did 5 or 10 years ago. We don't have the same amount of money. So when we send a person to the field in the future as a government, we need to make sure that they're going to the right spot at the right time to collect the right data. And that's what the precision type forestry that we see today and yesterday allows us to do. We also want to be able to integrate natural goods and services in a forest management planning decision. And a lot of the bodies of work that you've seen today and yesterday, again, allow us to actually do that on the landscape. We also are cognizant of the fact that we want to build on what we have. So when we started wet areas mapping, for example, our minds were solely focused on operations. Where could we put a road? Where would a bulldozer not get stuck? We moved from that to look at ecosystem function. But I guess even before that, we start layering data sets. So the very first one we start with is the LiDAR. And and you've heard today, we as a government are absolutely convinced that LiDAR is transformational. We've put a heck of a lot of investment in the LiDAR. We're very proud of the fact that we're a national leader or an international leader in terms of data acquisition. And now we're building on it. And the next layer on top of that was the wet areas mapping. And then on the top of that, on the one extreme, you see a lot of our investment into tool development. David talked about the recreational trail tool that allows us to build sustainable trails in a matter of hours or days, what would have taken months. We have a spill tool that will be rolling out in the next month or two that allows us to map where a spill will go within hours of knowing the exact location. But on the other end of that spectrum, we are using this type of data to look at ecosystem function. So you saw the presentations here by the scientists from the University of Alberta that are looking at those questions. And then sort of in the middle of that spectrum is looking at this type of data to answer questions related to forest management. But the point is that we're building on what we have to leverage previous investments. We also know that we have to restore trust in terms of forest stewardship. There was a Canada West Foundation report that came out within the last 6 months. You can read the quote on here, but I see all the letters that come into our minister, and it's a case where we have to continually improve through adaptive management how we manage our forests. We think right now that we have the best forest management system in Canada, but we also have to continue to strive to make improvements as we can. I've sort of touched on this already. We think we are a national leader right now in terms of precision forestry. We've backed that up with over a $20 million investment into LiDAR. But I hope that we're really at the start in terms of innovation. I hope we've been on a journey now in wet areas mapping for 10 years. I hope we're up here in another 10 years' time talking about how we've built on precision forestry, again, to make the economic and environmental decisions that we need to make. I've included this slide in terms of being a little bit transparent today. These are all of the investments that we've made over the last 10 years, mainly over the last 3 or 4 in terms of innovation and science, in terms of LiDAR. The first one and the most expensive one is the wet areas mapping. And actually within the last hour, we've signed off on a further grant agreement to expand our work. Along with that comes the recreational trail tool, the spill tool. But most of our investment now is on building on top of the wet areas mapping work itself. Most of that is with the University of Alberta, the University of British Columbia, and elsewhere on a whole host of different things. And a lot of these data sets in turn leverage data that's been collected over the last 10 or 20 years. And the EMIT experiment is the best example. But we've had exceptionally strong support from the Alberta government to make these type of very expensive investments. And we are always cognizant of the fact that we're spending your tax dollars. And but the goal here is to make sure that we continually improve the forest stewardship model. Moving forward, what I can announce here today is that we've had some preliminary discussions underway to incorporate wet areas mapping data formally into forest policy. So far today, once we produce wet areas mapping, it gets distributed to the forest industry and the public. And as we move forward, what we expect is that there will be a directive out that requires companies to use the wet areas mapping data, and that it will be probably a requirement that it come in with their annual operating plans, and that will streamline approvals, but it also gives us a level of assurance and the citizens a level of assurance that we are indeed protecting our water and soil resources. We expect that policy will be more robust or more likely to apply where we have the best data. The data that we're creating in the last year and a half is fundamentally better than what we were creating 6 or 7 years ago. So that's probably where the directive will be applied first. Since 2008, the wet areas mapping data has been available to the public where it's been produced, but the distribution has been limited to the stream layer and what we call the geotiff, or just sort of a picture on a map. Moving forward, we have a commitment that we will try to find a way to release all of the raw data, with the exclusion of the LiDAR data itself, which is a site license and restrictive. But all of the raw data, the flow accumulation, flow direction, stream layer attributes, etc., in its most robust and rawest form will be made available to the public. That allows for a greater level of transparency, but also application by third parties. We also have a commitment, as best that we can, that we're going to continue to fund the various research projects that we have started.